Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for our last class before the final examination. So, this is for Wednesday, the 11th of December, where we are finishing up the way we began. We started with talking about Stephen King and his text Dance Macabre, and I wanted to give you a little taste of Stephen King's writings. Stephen King is probably best known for writing novels and very long ones at that. So instead, what I did was I selected a couple of his short stories from one of his early anthologies entitled Night Shift for us to read. And I think you'll see now that we've gone through an entire semester that Stephen King is greatly indebted to the Gothic writers that we've studied. But he puts his own twist on it, which is one of the reasons why he's become such a popular and best selling author. And I began with assigning the forward. Luckily, I was able to find an online link where you could access this for free if it turns out that you don't have a copy of the text. The forward sounds a lot like Dance Macabre, where he's talking about horror and horror writers and how they're often maligned from his perspective because they bring bad news that death is inevitable, death being perhaps our biggest fear. And that what horror writers and Gothic authors do is they write a text that serves as a kind of filter between the conscious and the unconscious mind. In other words, these stories are allegorical, metaphorical, symbolic, which is how we've been studying them over the course of this semester. And his first short story, entitled Jerusalem's Lot, inspired his very famous Salem's Lot, which you might be aware of, that was also made into a miniseries. And I think also maybe a film. I'm not sure about that. And obviously, Jerusalem's Lot is an homage to Dracula and to previous Gothic texts. It's written in the epistolary format. We've seen how many of the early Gothic texts were written in journals and in letters. It's set in the 1800s, and we know that that would be the height of the very traditional Gothic novels such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We're told about an isolated bad home, and we always know that that's one of the messages in the world of the Gothic, that isolation is a bad thing. The answer ultimately is community and working together. The home has a very dark history. Think about how we talked about the haunting of Hill House and how oftentimes haunted homes have a sordid and historical past. And part of the history has to do with rats in the wall. If you know anything about Lovecraft's writings, in addition to what we studied in class, he has a very famous short story entitled Rats in the Walls. And there's also a reference to Anne Radcliffe. And if you don't know, Anne Radcliffe was a Gothic writer in the early days of the Gothic, which is kind of unusual because usually we talk about most Gothic authors being male. Though, of course, we started with Frankenstein, and that was written by Mary Shelley, who gave us a very male centric world. Perhaps that was one of the reasons why her story was able to be published. But that said, it was very critical of this male centric world. And it took us all the way until we got to The Haunting of Hill House, where we got another female author. And not only did we get Shirley Jackson as an author, but perhaps even more importantly, we got a female protagonist with Ellie, which is something that we didn't see with Frankenstein. And as we continue on, there are references to things like church desecrations that might ring a bell when you think about something like The Exorcist, which had central female characters. They were the ones who were tormented, at least physically, by supposedly the demonic presence, whether it was literally a demon or whether it was a manifestation of poltergeist activity or whether it was a combination of the two, whether it's just a symbolic retelling of the psychological demons that we all fight with and fight against, or some sort of way of combining the three, you can't help but think that when you've got specific references like this, that Stephen King obviously has a background in some of these texts and is using bits and pieces of them, but reformulating them to serve his own purposes. So he talks about the Nosferatu, which of course is in reference to the vampire and Dracula. He talks about incest and inbreeding, which of course is in reference to Lovecraft, as are whippoorwills, which are supposed to be harbingers to announce death, Yog-Sothoth, which also is one of the great mythological creatures um, in Lovecraft's creation of another world, and hereditary evil. So you read all of this, and of course, with the twist is that the evil doesn't end; it just continues on. But perhaps more interesting is One for the Road, because again, I had indicated that Stephen King, particularly between the 70s and the 90s, was able to capture American imaginations. And I think it was by modernizing many of the Gothic techniques. So, yes, we've got a Gothic tale that's set in New England, but it's specifically set in Maine. If you know anything about Stephen King, born, raised, and lived in Maine. So many of the locales of his story are in Maine. And oftentimes, much like Jack London, if you are familiar with Jack London's writings, he's not a Gothic author, but he oftentimes talks about nature and presents nature as an antagonist. And the famous nor'easter, if you've ever been in a nor'easter, if you've ever faced a massive snowstorm, then you probably understand what Stephen King is talking about how that is a kind of monstrosity in and of itself. And it's set in a bar, and the idea is that Jerusalem's lot continues, and it will eventually be known as Salem's Lot. I don't want to give away too much of either of the plots of the short stories. I wanted to, for today's last attendance question, just kind of get a sense as to what you thought of Stephen King's writing and why. What do you think of his two vampire stories? So I guess I'm giving away a little bit of One for the Road, that if Jerusalem's Lot continues, well, then vampires continue. But I see this as sort of closure for the semester as a whole, again, because Stephen King has become such a part of our popular culture. If you're looking for some Stephen King novels to read, I highly recommend The Shining, which is different from the film. The film is excellent, by the way. I'm talking about the Jack Nicholson version, but it's a different story. I can say that The Shining is perhaps the only book that's ever scared me, which is no small feat, considering that I'm always looking for a good scare. I used to, and I still actually recommend The Stand. It's a terrific book, but it is about a plague. And after COVID 19, it might feel a little bit too close for comfort. So that's the warning I give you if you're going to be writing about The Stand. So, our upcoming assignments, as you know, paper number 2, which can be on any of the later texts in the semester. That's going to be due this Monday on the 16th, and that is the last day in which you can submit paper number 2, because that is the last day of the semester. Because what I will be doing on the 16th is posting our final examination. And what I'm going to be doing is posting it at the time at which our class would normally meet. So I will post it at Monday at 8 a.m. And that will give you 24 hours in which to complete that exam. If you were taking that exam in a face-to-face class, you would have approximately 2 hours. So I'm expecting that you would spend approximately 2 hours working on that exam, not 24 hours. And it's open book, open notes, so you can reference class videos, you can reference discussion forum responses, previous papers, things of that nature. And I certainly don't expect anything as neat or as polished as what you would do with the paper. This is a final essay examination. That being said, I know that in 2 hours you can't produce the quality of work that you would produce in 2 weeks. What I'm hopeful is that you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end, an intro, body, and conclusion at the very least, and sentences that make sense, And you're able to talk about some of the themes that we've discussed over the course of the semester. And as you know, I like to ask questions that don't necessarily have right or wrong answers, questions that require reasoning. So you can expect that. You'll also have choice within the examination. So that said, in terms of the exam, I think what you will find is that if you've done the readings and you've watched the class videos, it's just a question, and you've read the discussion forum responses, that it's just a question of synthesizing that information. And certainly you can try to quote if you'd like, but I understand you've got only about 2 hours, so you might end up paraphrasing or doing some combination of the two, and that's fine because again, you're not writing necessarily an academic paper. So you will see the exam on Monday at 8 a.m. and it will be due on Tuesday at 8 a.m., 24 hours later. And I also have, if you look at the notes below, a brief farewell message from a friend of mine. That's a couple of minutes long that I thought you might enjoy, so put some closure to the class. And again, our last attendance question. This will be due on Friday, the 13th, no less. Yes, Friday the 13th. And of course, if you need a little bit of extra time, you can let me know, but you're not going to get a whole lot because basically everything ends on the 16th, except for the submission of your final examination, which would be on the 17th. So after reading Stephen King's 2 short stories, what did you think of his 2 vampire stories and why? So, once again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with the final examination. Take care. Bye-bye.